Did you ever have an idea that was so bizarre that it made people question your sanity? An idea so crazy that it might just be genius? Let me tell you how a bunch of arts majors went all in to create a company that now has more rooms than the biggest hotel chain in the world. It starts with these two guys, Joe Gebbia and Brian Chesky. After graduating from art school in Rhode Island, they both moved out west to California. Joe got a 9-to-5 job designing book covers at a publishing house and was absolutely miserable. He was living paycheck to paycheck, barely making enough to cover his expenses. He was desperately looking for a way out, and after months and months of trying to convince Brian to move in with him to start a business, the two finally started their entrepreneurial journey. They both quit their jobs at the same time and got down to business. But as soon as Brian moved in, they hit their first brick wall. That wall was rent. Rent was already expensive in California, and they got a notice that their rent was going to be 25% higher next month. After quitting their jobs, they barely had enough saved up to cover their expenses before, but with the rent increase, they needed to figure something out fast. And Joe and Brian were no ordinary guys. These were arts majors and approached all their problems with one simple question: can we design our way out of this? And then Joe sat back against his chair and remembered something that might just get them out of this. He remembered before he left Rhode Island, he was selling off all his stuff at a yard sale, and there was this one guy that bought a piece of art Joe was selling. He told Joe how he was in the Peace Corps and he was driving cross country but didn't know anyone in Providence. So Joe invited him out for a drink that night and made the mistake of asking him where he was staying, only to find out that he didn't have a place to stay. So Joe, without thinking, offered to let him stay at his place for the night. Joe set him up in the living room and spent the rest of the night terrified, hoping he didn't let some psychopath in to cannibalize his brains out in the middle of the night. But the next morning, he realized it wasn't so bad. They both woke up, got breakfast, and he was on his way. Not a serial killer, just a normal human being like you and me. Once he was done reminiscing, he looked at his laptop and saw there was a design conference happening nearby. And in big red letters, it read, "All hotels sold out." He looked around and saw they had plenty of room in their apartment and a bunch of airbeds in their closet. Why not host some people to stay at their place for the conference? Joe and Brian could even cook them breakfast. After launching a basic website called airbedandbreakfast.com, they started getting dozens of emails all over the world from people who needed a place to stay. People even sent resumes and LinkedIn profiles. For $80 a night, Joe and Brian ended up hosting 3 guests, and it was an experience no one would ever forget. The guests arrived as complete strangers, but over the weekend, they all bonded and left as friends. This wasn't a business idea. It was just a one-time thing for some quick cash to pay for rent. They shut down the site, and Airbed and Breakfast just became that weird story that you could tell your friends at parties. Speaking of parties, it wasn't until a New Year's party that Airbed and Breakfast would be brought back to life. At the New Year's party, everyone was asking Joe and Brian what they had been up to the past year. They were embarrassed to admit that they were jobless and not making any money. They told people they were entrepreneurs and shared their crazy Airbed and Breakfast story. Everyone that heard it had one of two reactions. Either they thought it was amazing and they wanted to do it too, or they thought it was the creepiest joke they've ever heard. But people did show interest of wanting to do something like that too for some fast cash. That's when Joe and Brian thought they might actually be onto something here. So they went back to the drawing board to extend their Airbed and Breakfast website to allow other people to be hosts too. They brought on their ex-roommate Nate Blasharsizek, who was a comp sci engineer from Harvard, to work on the site. Their next launch was going to be at the next big tech conference, which was South by Southwest. They had really high hopes for the launch, but a few weeks after launching, they only had 6 people sign up on their listing with 2 bookings, and one of them was Brian. It was a complete, utter failure. No one cared. Joe and Brian were devastated. But they learned 2 things. The first was that exchanging money in person was very awkward, so they figured, why not make the transactions online? they can flow the funds from guests to hosts and take a small transaction fee from the process. And suddenly, they have a business model. The second thing was there wasn't just potential in conferences, but in travel as well. They were getting emails from travelers who weren't going to any conferences but were interested. They just needed a place to stay without paying the really high hotel rates. As Joe, Brian, and Nate were learning from their mistakes, their next golden opportunity was fast approaching. This was around the time when Obama was first running for president and the US was in the middle of the election between Obama and McCain. There was going to be a large Democratic National Convention happening in Denver, Colorado, where hundreds of thousands of people were coming to hear Obama speak. The problem was there were only 30,000 hotel rooms, most of which were picked up by delegates. All the major news stations were blowing this way out of proportion, saying this was going to be the next big housing crisis. The mayor even thought to open up the city's parks so people could camp out there. Joe and Brian took full advantage of this chaotic situation to make their next launch. They flew over to Denver with a solution, and then, like a domino effect, they got featured in local press, which turned into regional press, which turned into national press, and eventually international press. They had over 100 people book and pay for their service. This was the first sign that their idea was evolving into a working business. They went from 0 to 800 homes in just 4 weeks. Things were going great, but then the convention ended and all the numbers came crashing back down. Now, this was a huge problem because they already started talking to investors when things were going good. They emailed 20 investors, 10 replied back, 5 met for coffee, and 0 invested. These were the kinds of investors who invest in big opportunistic companies like Facebook or Twitter, and they all thought Airbnb and breakfast was a crappy idea for one reason, and that is, we've all been taught as kids that strangers equal danger. There's no way a site where people take pictures of their most intimate spaces and put it up on the internet to invite strangers was going to be the next big thing, or at least that's what they thought. With no investors and no customers, they were broke. They started maxing out all their credit cards just to keep the business running, and every month the credit card statements would just keep going up. They were knee-deep in debt. And then one evening, Joe and Brian had a crazy idea that might just get them out of this. This was in the peak of the Obama versus McCain election. They thought maybe they could give their guests breakfast cereal in the morning, and wouldn't it be funny if it was politically themed? They could call it Obama O's and Captain McCain's. So they called up Kellogg's to pitch them their idea, but no one answered. So they called the smaller cereal companies next and got an answer. The smaller cereal companies could make the cereal for them, but just needed a deposit of $200,000. Obviously, that's not an option for two broke guys. Then it dawned on them. Maybe they didn't have to actually make the cereal. Maybe they could just make their own box and buy some random dollar cereal off the shelf at some ghetto grocery store and put it in their own box. They got in touch with a local RISD alumni who could make the boxes for them. Joe poured out their entire life story to him, explaining their situation. This guy was so touched that he offered to make 500 boxes of each cereal for free, with the condition that if they actually ended up selling, he'd get a commission. Joe and Brian then realized, with 500 of each box, that's limited edition. They can price it like a collector's item and put a number on top of each box out of 500. So they figured they could sell each cereal box for $40. But they still needed a way to get people's attention. So they mailed out 100 boxes to all the press, every morning show you can think of. This ended up getting them featured on all the different shows. CNN even did a live interview with them. In just a few hours, they made out like bandits, selling out $20,000 from breakfast cereal. That was just enough for them to climb back from the hell that is credit card debt to a zero balance. Clearly, these guys were hustlers, but they still needed some serious help to get their original Air Bed and Breakfast idea off the ground. Their mentor, Michael Seibel, suggested that they participate in the mentorship incubator program Y Combinator. So they signed up, but when they got into their interview with Paul Graham, things took a turn. Like the investors they pitched to before, Paul also thought this was a weird idea and didn't see it as something a lot of people would use. Joe, Brian, and Nate were pretty convinced that they blew it, and then at the end, they pulled out a box of Obama O's to give to Paul as a gift. At first, Paul was confused why they handed him a box of cereal, until they told him that it was their cereal and their crazy story of how they sold $20,000 worth of cereal. Later that day, they got a call from Paul telling them that they got a spot in the program. It was because their breakfast cereal story proved that they had the hustle, and if they could sell that, then they can figure this out too. Throughout the program, they had one-on-one mentorship meetings with Paul. One of the things they learned was when starting out to do things that don't scale. Things like going out to your users to talk to them one-on-one and seeing things from their perspective. At the time, most of their hosts on Air Bed and Breakfast were from New York, so Joe and Brian got on a flight to meet the early adopters of their service. And as they looked through their listings, they saw some patterns. In general, people were really crappy photographers. They had no idea how to take pictures of their homes. They weren't merchandising it, so no one was booking them. Joe took some photography classes back when he was in art school, so he figured he could take some better pictures of the place and give it to them for free while they went up there to meet them. When the hosts saw these pictures, they were blown away at how much better they were. And once they started talking, Joe and Brian found out that they had a bunch of problems with their website. Their website interface was horrible. What they thought would take 2 to 3 clicks actually took their users 10 to 11 clicks. People would get lost. When they got back to make all these changes, something unexpected happened. At first, they were making $200 a week in fees for 6 months, which was nothing to support 3 guys. But that jumped to $400 a week just from the pictures they took for their hosts in 1 week. All the hosts they met were getting more reservations. New York was a popular travel destination. People from all around the world were coming to New York as tourists. This is when they realized that Airbnb could be seriously big in the travel space. It was around this time that investors actually started approaching them. They were able to quickly get a round of financing from a large investment firm, Sequoia Capital, which they could use to pay their rent and hire a team to really get this to take off. And that is the story of how Airbnb was founded.